Hi, this is Randy. This is Dimension 5 of sexual addiction-induced trauma, external crisis and destabilization. External crisis and destabilization means all the practical changes, sudden or long-term external changes, and the overwhelming chaos that ensues and often endures as a direct result of the sex addiction, particularly post-ego fragmentation, and as a result of all the associated dynamics of abuse and violation in the aftermath and fallout of the car accident / ink in water. These dynamics are a significant source of stress that alone often can cause functional impairment. This can include concerns related to finances, moving, separate sleeping arrangements, changes in routine, sudden shifts in residence, child care routines changed, co-parenting dynamics altered, impact on family system, disclosures, what to say to who, or how to find treatment, being stalked by others. This includes practical concerns that may impact trauma, such as people who are poor and who definitely cannot afford treatment. Medical and psychosomatic conditions are likely, as discussed in Dimension 4. Yet the lack of resources is also likely, leaving many partners in medical despair. Furthermore, it is imperative to note that because the addict is the identified patient, the partner or spouse often may end up holding down the fort and being the together one in the early stages of the process. This may result in a profound submerging of trauma, a form of extreme traumatic constriction based on survival. It may only be when the conditions have stabilized or there is actual increased safety or functionality in the sex addict or the family system, and the perpetration and abuse stops before a partner could ever contact or metabolize her traumatic fragmentation and dissociative experiences. So what I'd like to add is this does not take into account if the partner is also a narcissist, because if he or she is, then we know the perpetration and abuse never stops. Therefore, the partner will most likely have traumatic fragmentations and dissociative experiences that have metabolized in the brain. The sexual addiction-induced traumatic submergence is a characteristic of this dimension of trauma and needs to be accounted for in both conceptualization and clinical intervention and treatment. The omission of recognizing the external and practical stressors that the injured partner may have to manage, such as holding down the fort while traumatized, often induces or exaggerates SAIT. The seeming assumption that the partner is functional and obligated becomes disorienting in light of the partner's subjective and actual experience of self. This is often linked with ego fragmentation, which both perceives and adapts to reality. Thus, essentially, it is often during a critical injury of ego trauma that the partner is then implicitly mandated to perform gender-based or parent-based obligations. This can sometimes link to gender wounds in that often women are taken for granted for this, quote, work. And in the context of experience SAIT, this, quote, normal work can become a source of trauma, exaggeration, exacerbation, and or include traumatic incidents and processes based on external crisis and destabilization. Dimension 6, SAIT hypervigilance and re-experiencing. According to the DSM version 5, PTSD is often characterized by heightened sensitivity to potential threats, including those that are related to the traumatic experience. The DSM-5 describes the symptom of re-experiencing as covering spontaneous memories of the traumatic event, recurring dreams related to it, flashbacks, or other intense or prolonged psychological distress. It then also describes the symptom of arousal by being marked by aggressive, reckless, or self-destructive behavior, sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, and related problems. And I'm going to add at this point, when the victim spouse presents themselves to a mental health professional, this is at the point where they may wrongly become diagnosed as borderline personality. The current manual emphasizes the flight aspect associated with PTSD. The criteria of DSM-5 also accounts for the fight reaction often seen in trauma symptom sequences. Hyperarousal and re-experiencing is a well-established symptom of trauma in which specific internal and external and objective-subjective stimuli, perceptions, thoughts, feelings, or sensations will remind the psyche of the trauma, and the system will react to the stimulus, causing psychological, cognitive, and emotional changes related to fear, panic, and feelings associated with traumatic memory. SAIT reactivation and re-experiencing among partners and spouses can become crippling in terms of clinical and functional impairment due to intensity, frequency, and pervasiveness of reactivation cues. Triggers can be so nuanced and different for every partner. It could be billboards, magazines, other women, cell phones, blonde hair, texting, computers, cities, massages, intimacy, sexual positions, Hispanic women, etc. Agoraphobia, panic attacks, dissociative and fear-based perceptual lens will pervade, and the consequent psychological, cognitive, defensive systems of protection will emerge and be present in the victim. Hyperarousal, hypervigilance, re-experiencing, and the symptomatology of trauma reactivation based on cues is a well-established science in the field of trauma and clearly applies to partners and spouses impacted by sex addiction-induced trauma. However, diagnostic terms such as, quote, snoopervising have emerged and are used among traditional sex addiction therapists to actually reframe traumatic re-experiencing and behavioral correlates of hypervigilance. Instead of the more accurate diagnostic concept of hypervigilance and understanding a partner's behaviors as post-traumatic, quote, safety-seeking behaviors, end quote, many sex addiction therapists reframe a partner's safety-seeking attempts as pathological co-sex addiction slips that define and demonstrate the partner's unmanageability. Oh no. The partner's unmanageability and proof and confirmation of her insanity. Oh no. Oh no. Bullshit. The clinical and professional utilization of terms such as snoopervising, pain shopping, or playing victim to describe people in traumatic hypervigilance reactivity is a form of professional perpetration according to the SAIT model, and further have no legitimate or ethical place in clinical practice or within any professional realm. So he is clearly describing the abuse that continues to be perpetrated by mental health professionals hardcore ignorant. Dimension 7. I'm going to try to get through this with the time I have left on this video. Dimension 7 is sex addiction-induced perpetration. Policymakers and clinical researchers give psychological and emotional abuse considerably less attention than physical abuse based on traditional definitions of domestic violence. However, psychological and emotional abuse can impact a human being just as much as physical abuse in terms of harm, symptoms, and traumatic impacts. Sex addiction-induced perpetration includes emotional abuse, psychological abuse, family and relational domination, covert management of deceptive, compartmentalized reality, sexual abuse and coercion, child neglect and abuse, and other patterns of harm to human beings and violation of rights termed sex addiction-induced perpetrations. And Minwala is the man who coined that term, and it was just in 2012 that he did it. Okay? This is brand new, people. Clinical terms such as perpetration, victimization, abuse, and trauma are appropriate terms based on clinical standards of care and recommendations by the APA related to the diagnosis and treatment of psychological and emotional abuse. Sylvia Jason was the primary author who initially articulated patterns of emotional abuse utilized by sex addicts against partners in covert management. Jason also contributed the concept of gaslighting as applied in the context of partners and spouses impacted by SAIT and articulated the patterns of emotional abuse such as threats, sidetracking, blaming the partner, gaslighting, and covert emotional abuse that results in emotional trauma and wounding. Gaslighting is the process in which the addict intentionally manipulates a partner's reality in order to protect reality and the truth from becoming known or discovered by the partner. This is a form of psychological manipulation and covert psycho-emotional abuse and perpetration. The serious damage that can often result from gaslighting a person is that it erodes or ruptures the person's relationship between their own psyche and their intuition or gut instincts. This is actually one of our most important relationships because it helps us navigate decision-making as essential for adaptive survival. Our connection between our psyche and our intuition is needed for survival and in order to make effective decisions on the most fundamental levels. The impact of chronic patterns of psychological manipulation over time is the slow erosion or weakening of one's relationship between the victim's psyche and their intuition. Sometimes there can be a progressive reliance and eventual dependency on the perpetrator's reality as the victim's adapted, quote, survival instinct, end quote. Thus, if the ability to utilize one's own intuition is so compromised, and abused, and or if the victim has been manipulated into deep dependency and reliance on the perpetrator's definition and mandate of reality, then the victim may not be able to generate emancipation impulses based on instinctual self-generation. The idea of just leaving is not reality-based for certain partners and spouses who have been victimized and abused via gaslighting, which constitutes a specific type and form of psychological abuse and torture, and a significant sex-addicted-induced perpetration, often highly relevant to sex addiction disorders and a partner's traumatic clinical configuration. And I'm going to end there and pick that up in the next video. Thanks for listening.